She thought it was just another rude customer. She had no idea the man at the counter was a billionaire, until he left behind an offer she couldn't ignore. The neon sign outside Rosie's diner flickered against the dark sky, its red glow casting tired shadows onto the empty pavement. Inside, the smell of fried bacon, coffee, and cheap cleaning solution clung to the air like an old habit. Layla Reed barely noticed anymore. Her feet ached, her back screamed, and the clock above the register seemed to be mocking her. 2:14 a.m., still 3 hours to go. Another double shift. Another night of pretending she wasn't drowning. She grabbed a damp rag and wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that night. The radio played an old country song in the background, the kind of tune that made truckers nostalgic and waitresses numb. The door swung open. Layla glanced up, already bracing herself. The couple who walked in looked expensive. The woman in a sleek blazer and heels too high for a place like this. The man with a silver watch that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. They didn't fit in here. And judging by the way the woman wrinkled her nose, she knew it. Layla straightened her apron and put on her best customer service smile as they slid into a booth. She walked over, pen in hand. "Good evening. What can I get started for you?" The woman sighed, not even bothering to look up from her phone. "Coffee, extra hot, and make sure it's fresh." Layla knew that tone. The same one she had heard from impatient doctors in hospital waiting rooms. From landlords who weren't running a charity. From customers who thought people like her didn't deserve basic respect. She swallowed the retort bubbling at the back of her throat and nodded. "Coming right up." As she turned, she caught sight of someone new. A man had taken a seat at the far end of the counter. He hadn't been there a second ago. Layla's pulse ticked up, not in fear, but in awareness. Something about him stood out. Neatly dressed, crisp shirt under a dark coat, well groomed in a way that suggested money, but not arrogance. He wasn't scrolling through his phone or drumming his fingers like most late-night customers. He was just watching. Not in a creepy way, not in an impatient way, just watching. Layla hesitated before approaching. "Can I get you anything?" The man looked up, his gaze steady. "I'm good. Just watching." His voice was deep, smooth, calm. And for some reason, it sent a shiver down her spine. Not fear. Something else. Before she could dwell on it, a sharp snap cut through the air. The woman in the booth. "Waitress, hello? I don't have all night." Layla turned, heart sinking. She already knew exactly how this was going to go. Layla moved quickly, pouring the coffee with practiced efficiency. Fresh, piping hot, no room for complaints. She had learned a long time ago that people like this didn't actually care about the coffee. It was about control, about seeing how far they could push someone before they broke. She placed the cup in front of the woman with a steady hand. "Here you go. Let me know if you need anything else." The woman lifted the cup to her lips, pausing dramatically before taking a sip. Layla already knew what was coming. A slow, exaggerated grimace. A scoff. Then, the inevitable complaint. "Are you serious? This is barely warm." The man across from her sighed, shaking his head as if Layla had personally ruined his night. "We should have gone somewhere better." Layla's fingers curled into her apron. She knew better than to argue, better than to roll her eyes, better than to show any sign that she was affected. She had been working in diners since she was 16, and people like this were as predictable as the sunrise. "I can bring you a new one." The woman let out a dramatic sigh, like Layla had just asked her to recite the alphabet backwards. "You know what? Just forget it. I don't even want it anymore." Layla forced a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "No problem." She turned to leave, but before she could, the woman muttered just loud enough for her to hear. "God, is it that hard to get a simple order right?" Layla's stomach tightened. Don't react. Don't give them the satisfaction. She had bills to pay, a sick mother at home, A little brother who still needed new shoes for school. A job like this didn't leave room for pride. She walked back to the counter, pretending she couldn't feel the weight of their judgment pressing into her back. The laminated menu was peeling at the edges. The air conditioning rattled in its vent. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, making everything feel too bright, too harsh. And yet, none of that compared to the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. 12 hours on her feet, minimum wage, the knowledge that even with tips, she'd barely scrape by this month. She rubbed at the tension in her neck, exhaling slowly. The quiet man at the counter was still watching. Layla turned to him, raising an eyebrow. "Something on my face?" For the first time, he smiled, just a little. "You always let people treat you like that?" Layla let out a dry laugh. "You must not go to many diners." The man tilted his head slightly, considering her response. "I go to plenty, but I don't see people handle it the way you do." Layla didn't know how to respond to that. She wasn't sure if it was a compliment, an observation, or something else entirely. She shrugged, wiping her hands on her apron. "I don't have the luxury of telling people off." She gestured around the diner. "This job keeps my family afloat. That's all that matters." The man watched her for a beat longer, then nodded. "I respect that." Before Layla could say anything, the woman in the booth waved her hand sharply, her gold bracelets clinking together. "Waitress, we're ready for the check." Layla inhaled deeply, pressing her nails into her palm to ground herself. Just get through the night, just like every other night. She turned back to the booth, but something about the way the man at the counter had looked at her stayed with her, like he saw something in her that no one else ever had. Layla slid the check onto the table, careful to keep her expression neutral. She already knew what was coming. People like this didn't tip. They barely acknowledged that she existed. The woman barely glanced at the receipt before pulling a sleek black credit card from her purse and tossing it onto the table like it was an afterthought. "Hurry up, will you? We're already late." Layla swallowed the sharp response rising in her throat. "Keep it professional. Keep it moving." She grabbed the card, turning toward the register. The machine whirred as it processed the payment, and she drummed her fingers on the counter, forcing herself not to glance back at the couple. Instead, her gaze landed on the man at the far end of the counter. He hadn't moved, hadn't ordered anything, hadn't even so much as touched the menu in front of him. Just sitting there, watching. Something about him felt deliberate. Layla wasn't sure why it bothered her. She had seen her fair share of odd late-night customers, drifters, truckers, people with nowhere else to go. But this man, he didn't fit here. He was dressed too sharp, too clean-cut. His posture was too composed, too still, like he was completely unaffected by the world around him. And yet, he had been paying attention. To her. The receipt printed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She walked back to the couple's table, placing the slip down with practiced indifference. The woman grabbed it, signing with a dramatic flick of her wrist before dropping the pen onto the table. No, thank you. No acknowledgement. Just a slight sneer as she stood, slinging her purse over her shoulder. "Let's go," she muttered to her husband. Layla took a deep breath, waiting until they were fully out the door before picking up the receipt. No tip. Not even a single crumpled dollar. Her chest tightened, but she wasn't surprised. Disappointed? Sure. Annoyed? Absolutely. But surprised? Never. She was about to head back to the counter when she noticed something out of the corner of her eye. Movement. The quiet man was slipping something beneath his untouched coffee cup. Layla frowned. Was it a note? A business card? She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward him. But before she could say anything, he stood. He adjusted the sleeves of his dark coat with a quiet, effortless precision. Then he turned to face her. "Have a good night, Layla." Layla's breath hitched. She hadn't told him her name. Before she could respond, the bell above the door jingled, and just like that, he was gone. She stood there for a moment, staring at the door, her pulse thrumming. Then, slowly, she reached for the coffee cup and lifted it. Her breath caught in her throat. A check. Her fingers trembled as she picked it up, unfolding it carefully. The first thing she saw was the amount. $10,000. Layla felt the ground tilt beneath her. Her heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst right through her ribs. $10,000. She blinked, convinced she had read it wrong. But no. There it was, clear as day, written in smooth, confident ink. And at the bottom, a signature. Elijah Carter. Layla's stomach dropped. That name. It sounded familiar. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone, fingers shaking as she typed into Google. Elijah Carter. The page loaded in seconds, and her breath left her body. Billionaire, tech mogul, philanthropist. Layla's pulse roared in her ears. She had just served one of the richest men in the country, and she hadn't even known it. And now, he had left her a tip that could change her life. Her mind scrambled for answers. Why her? Was this real? Could she even accept it? Her vision blurred. Her hands shook. This wasn't just a tip. This was something else. And whatever it was, she wasn't sure she was ready for it. Layla sat in the break room, her hands still trembling as she stared at the check. $10,000. The numbers blurred in front of her eyes, like her brain refused to process them. Her whole body felt wired, buzzing with a strange mix of excitement, confusion, and panic. She turned the check over, half expecting to find a catch, a note scrawled on the back that said, "Just kidding." But no, it was real. The paper was thick, the ink smooth. The signature at the bottom was crisp and deliberate. She felt like she had been thrown into a dream, one of those ridiculous, over-the-top rags-to-riches stories people shared online. But this wasn't a story. This was her life. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out her phone. Google. She typed in his name again. Elijah Carter. The results loaded instantly. Net worth, $2.3 billion. Founder of Carter Industries, a tech empire that revolutionized artificial intelligence. Philanthropist, known for mentorship programs, scholarships, and quietly changing lives without seeking attention. Raised by a single mother. Worked 3 jobs before landing his first big break. Layla's breath caught. He had been her. Or at least, someone like her. Someone who knew what it was like to scrape by. To survive instead of live. Her heart pounded as she stared at the screen. The article was filled with photos of him at galas, shaking hands with CEOs, speaking at conferences. And yet just a few hours ago, he had been sitting in her diner, watching her struggle, watching her push through it like she always did. Why? Why her? Layla let out a shaky breath and closed her eyes. This money. It could change everything. She could pay off her mum's hospital bills. She could finally fix the broken radiator in their apartment that made winters unbearable. She could buy her little brother the new school supplies he had been too embarrassed to ask for. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. And yet, a voice in her head whispered, "People like you don't get things for free." She had spent her entire life learning that nothing came without a price. That kindness always had an angle. Generosity always came with strings. Was this some kind of test? A game? She exhaled, trying to steady herself. Maybe she should just cash it. No one had to know. He wouldn't even miss it. But another thought nagged at her. What if it's not just about the money? A knock at the door made her jump. Joe, the night cook, peered in. His white apron was stained with grease, his greying beard tucked into his collar. He had worked at Rosie's for 20 years, seen more burnt-out waitresses come and go than he could count. "You okay, kid?" he asked, squinting at her. Layla forced a smile, tucking the check into her apron pocket. "Yeah, just tired." Joe didn't look convinced. His eyes drifted to her hands, still shaking, even as she tried to hide it. He let out a small grunt, walking over to grab a styrofoam cup from the shelf. "I saw that guy leave you something." Layla tensed. "Yeah, just a tip." Joe snorted. "Some tip. Looked more like a damn envelope." He poured himself a cup of coffee, then leaned against the counter. "You know who that was?" Layla hesitated. "Yeah, Elijah Carter." Joe let out a low whistle. Didn't peg him as the billionaire type. Layla frowned. "Why?" Joe shrugged, taking a slow sip of his coffee. "He watched you like he knew you." A chill crawled up Layla's spine. "Like he was trying to figure something out," Joe added. "Or maybe just waiting for you to realize it." Layla swallowed hard. She didn't know what to say. Joe pushed off the counter, giving her a long look. "Whatever that check is for, just be careful, kid." Layla nodded, but her mind was already spinning. Careful of what? The money? The man who left it? Or the possibility that, for the first time in her life, someone had seen her, really seen her, and decided she was worth something? Her phone buzzed. Layla glanced down. Unknown number. She hesitated, her pulse spiking. Slowly, she swiped to answer. "Hello?" A smooth, professional voice responded. "Good morning, Miss Reed. My name is Daniel Hayes. I work for Mr. Carter." Layla's breath caught. "He'd like to meet with you." Layla's grip on her phone tightened. Meet with him. Her heart pounded, her thoughts racing. Why would Elijah Carter, a man who probably had an army of assistants, a calendar booked months in advance, and a life completely removed from hers, want to meet with her? Her first instinct was to say no. This was too much, too strange. People like her didn't get invitations like this. She swallowed hard. "Stay calm. Be smart." I think you have the wrong person." The voice on the other end didn't waver. "No, Miss Reed. Mr. Carter was very clear. He'd like to speak with you personally." Layla turned away from Joe, who was still watching her with quiet curiosity, and lowered her voice. "Why?" A brief pause. "Mr. Carter believes in rewarding those who deserve it." Layla's breath caught. That word again. Deserve. She clenched her free hand into a fist. What had she done to deserve anything? She had worked herself to exhaustion, sure. Smiled through rude customers. Paid bills that barely left room for food. But that wasn't special. That was just life. She let out a slow, shaky breath. "What exactly does he want from me?" "He'll explain everything in person," the man replied smoothly. "We can send a car to your workplace. Or, if you prefer, you can meet us at Carter Industries this afternoon." Layla nearly laughed. Carter Industries. A place she had only seen on TV, a shining glass tower in the heart of Memphis, filled with people so far removed from her world it might as well have been a different planet. Her stomach twisted. She didn't belong there. Her mind screamed at her to say no. This wasn't normal. Money like this didn't just fall into people's laps without a catch. And yet, the check was still folded in her apron pocket, burning against her skin like a secret she wasn't supposed to have. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about why. Why had he left it? Why her? And why, after walking out of the diner without a word, had he decided to reach out again? Joe cleared his throat behind her, and she turned. "Everything all right?" he asked, voice low. Layla hesitated. She had two choices. Hang up, walk away, pretend none of this ever happened, step into something bigger than herself. Her voice came out before she had time to second-guess it. "I'll come to Carter Industries." She didn't know why she said it. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the quiet, terrifying thought that this could be the moment that changed everything. The man on the other end of the line didn't sound surprised. "I'll send the details shortly. See you at noon, Miss Reed." The line went dead. Layla stared at her phone, her heart hammering. What had she just agreed to? Joe raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" She shoved her phone into her pocket, gripping the counter to steady herself. No. She wasn't sure about anything. But for the first time in a long time, she felt something she hadn't in years. Hope. Layla sat stiffly in the back of a sleek black SUV, her hands gripping her purse like a lifeline. Everything about this felt wrong. Not in a dangerous way, but in a "this isn't my life" way. The leather seats beneath her were too soft. The air smelled too clean, like luxury instead of the burnt coffee and cheap disinfectant she was used to. The driver, a man in a pressed suit who hadn't spoken a word, had opened the door for her like she was someone important. She wasn't. She was a waitress who had gotten too caught up in something she didn't understand. The car glided through the streets of Memphis, Tennessee, the towering skyline getting closer with every second. Carter Industries loomed in the distance, all glass and steel, reflecting the sun like something untouchable. She shouldn't be here. Her stomach twisted. But at the same time, she couldn't turn back now. The SUV pulled up to the entrance. A man in a charcoal suit, the same voice from the phone call, was already waiting for her. Daniel Hayes. He opened the door for her, offering a polite smile. "Miss Reed, welcome." Layla stepped out, trying not to feel wildly out of place as she followed him inside. The lobby was massive, high ceilings, floors that gleamed so perfectly she could see her own scuffed sneakers reflected back at her. Employees in expensive suits walked past, barely sparing her a glance. Daniel led her through a set of double doors, down a long hallway, and finally stopped in front of a large oak door. He knocked once. "Come in." Daniel pushed the door open, gesturing for her to enter. Layla's heart pounded as she stepped inside. The office was just as overwhelming as the rest of the building. Spacious, modern, floor-to-ceiling windows that stretched across an entire wall, overlooking the city. And there, sitting behind a sleek black desk, was Elijah Carter. He looked just as composed as he had at the diner. Same calm presence, same sharp gaze that made her feel like he saw things no one else did. Layla swallowed hard. What the hell was she doing here? Elijah gestured to the chair across from him. "Have a seat." She hesitated but sat down, gripping her purse tightly in her lap. Elijah leaned forward, resting his forearms on the desk. "I imagine you have a lot of questions." Layla let out a breathy laugh, shaking her head. "That's one way to put it." He didn't smile, but there was something in his expression, a flicker of something knowing, like he understood exactly how she felt. "You remind me of someone," he said finally. Layla frowned. "Who?" His dark eyes studied her. "Me." She blinked. "Him?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, clasping his hands together. "I know struggle when I see it. I know what it's like to work yourself to the bone and still feel like you're barely staying afloat." He tilted his head slightly. "I had people who gave me a shot when I had nothing. I want to do the same for you." Layla's breath caught. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but not this. He reached into his desk and slid a folder across to her. "I'm offering you a position at my foundation. Full salary, benefits. You'd be working directly with families who need help." Layla stared at the folder, her hands frozen in place. This wasn't just money. This was an escape. A way out. She opened it slowly, her eyes scanning the words. A real job. A real future. Her throat tightened. This was everything she had dreamed of. And yet, doubt crept in. Why her? Why now? Could she even do this? She looked up at Elijah, searching his face for any sign of a catch. Why me? Her voice was barely above a whisper. For the first time, his expression softened. Because I see something in you. The same fire I had when I was clawing my way out. Layla swallowed hard. For years she had been in survival mode, working, paying bills, making sure everyone else was okay. She had never let herself think about what she wanted. But now she had a choice. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel trapped. She felt seen. She took a deep breath, the weight of everything pressing down on her. Then, slowly, she reached for the pen. The pen felt heavy in Layla's hand, not because of its weight, but because of what it meant. Signing this paper wasn't just accepting a job, it was stepping into a life she never thought she could have. A real career, a salary that wasn't dependent on rude customers and long shifts, a chance to help others, people like her, people who were barely making it but still fighting, still pushing forward. But was she really ready? She hesitated, staring at the crisp contract in front of her. Elijah watched her carefully, his expression unreadable. You don't have to say yes. His voice was calm, steady. But if you do, it's not just for you. It's for the people you'll help. Layla swallowed. He was right. She had spent so much time surviving that she had forgotten what it felt like to dream. Slowly, deliberately, she pressed the pen to the paper. Her signature flowed across the line, smooth and final. Done. A strange feeling washed over her, something she hadn't felt in years. Relief. Hope. A future. She set the pen down, her fingers trembling. Elijah nodded once. Welcome to Carter Foundation. Layla let out a shaky breath. Thank you. The words didn't feel like enough, but Elijah just stood, extending his hand. She shook it, the weight of her old life slipping away with every second. She wasn't just a waitress anymore. She wasn't just struggling to get by. She was stepping into something new, something bigger. And for the first time in her life, she felt like she deserved it. Sometimes, life puts people in our path who see something in us that we don't see in ourselves. Opportunities don't always come wrapped in ways we expect, but when they do, we have to be brave enough to take them. Layla wasn't chosen because she was special. She was chosen because she kept going when life gave her every reason to give up. And maybe, just maybe, that's what made her special after all. If this story moved you, subscribe for more powerful narratives that remind us of the strength in everyday people. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because sometimes the right story can change everything.